Good afternoon and welcome to the November Afro-Oriental Studies seminar. Today we are going to host a meeting with Dr. Joanna Ciesielska and from the Faculty of Oriental Studies and Agnes Dudek from Adam Mickiewicz Institute, who are the winners of the last edition of Little Archaeo-Oriental Studies competition. They are going to present the results of their project in a presentation entitled Keepers of the Tradition, Communicating Status via Attire Among Sudanese Women. Recording, and the floor is yours. As usual, you have 1 hour for presentation and half an hour for the discussion.
Okay, let me check if I can share the screen. Can you see it now?
Not yet. Yes.
Yes. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. It's a real pleasure being here. So before we start talking about the project and its results, of course, let me provide you with some context. So, as some of you know, my background is in funerary archaeology and physical anthropology. During my PhD, I grew an interest in social archaeology of funerary remains in medieval Nubia. And I wanted to learn more about the people of medieval Nubia, which is not a topic that has been extensively studied. The subject of my PhD was trying to reconstruct the social identities of the deceased based on various features of mortuary remains, such as funerary architecture, various biological markers, written sources, etc. It quickly became clear that such an analysis requires a multidisciplinary approach. Another thing that came to the foreground was the fact that women were especially neglected and underrepresented in the archaeological research of this period and this area. There is a lot more evidence on male activities in the past of this region, as men tended to perform official duties and figure a lot more often in any written records. So a while ago, an idea was born to investigate the women of medieval Nubia and give them back their voice, basically. So right from the start, I figured this needed to be a multi-pronged endeavor, taking into account not only the archaeological record, but also the wealth of ethnographic data. Obviously, I'm not a cultural anthropologist, so I always wanted to work with a specialist to combine our efforts. And approximately a year ago, Dobrachna Zielińska actually introduced me to Agnes Dudek, who is a cultural anthropologist and who is with me here today and who will be presenting shortly. And we have decided to join forces for this small pilot study on the way women communicate authority via dress. It was always designed as a reconnaissance for future inquiries, hence its small scale. The subject of the project, called Keepers of Tradition, was the investigation of the way women inject meaning into their appearance, the way status is communicated via clothing. The main, I hope this works. Yeah. So modern Sudanese women is the top. The top in Arabic is a generic term for clothing, but in the case of Sudanese women, it means an outer seamless garment 4 to 5 meters in length by 2 meters in width. Initially made of cotton, but presently also of synthetic fabrics, of course. The top is a statement of social status. It distinguishes married women from unmarried ones. Especially until the 1950s, the top was exclusively a married woman's garment. Different qualities of the top indicate wealth and sophistication. And finally, among the diaspora, it's a symbol of national identity. It survived into the 21st century because of its beauty and overall usefulness. It can be used as an overcoat, a mosquito net, a night dress, a pouch for carrying things, a curtain to breastfeed babies in public. Especially the blue-dyed Zarach top traces its roots to the indigo cultivation in the 19th century Dongola region. Until the 1960s, it remained the cheapest and was mostly tied to rural communities of riverine agricultural areas. Later, women replaced top zarach with krib aswad, a black voile, or black or brown farda. In late 60s and 70s, this in turn was replaced by very cheap colored or patterned tops imported from India called top jaran, which occupies a place somewhere between the roughest black top worn for work and the best fine quality top used for formal outings. In the 1950s, most women had only two tops, the zarach for everyday wear and the abyad white top for ceremonial visits to weddings and funerals. Midwives, nurses, and teachers were actually the first Sudanese women to enter the work market. While midwives and nurses have a formal uniform of cotton dress and white top of plain material, schoolmistresses have retained the white top as being the respectable garment for work. Later, the same voluntary uniform was adopted by female students and other working women in the civil service or private companies. Until the 70s and 80s, a woman's best top was usually a fine white voile of the best quality. Then gradually, very pale pastel colors of the same material began to be worn. Initially, colored tops were considered vulgar or to be from a tribal area outside the valley. However, over the last decades, all this has changed and very colorful tops are worn for every other occasion. So despite the fact that top is not a dated piece of clothing, we wanted to inquire about women's approach to the choice of clothing in terms of the social structuring of Sudanese communities, and eventually, how can any information inferred from those inquiries be transposed onto the archaeological and historical investigations into the reality of life in the Sudanese Nile Valley in the past? Since I was already embedded in two archaeological projects in Sudan, the one in Soba led by Dr. Mariusz Drzewiecki, and the one in Miseida directed by Dobrowna herself, we have decided to start with those two communities. During 6 weeks of fieldwork, which was conducted within those two communities, Agnes was accompanied by Fatima Ali Idris Mahmoud, a Sudanese archaeologist belonging to the northern Mahas ethnic group, who served as a translator and provided us with some very important cultural insights we probably wouldn't be able to access without her. Finally, as Zuza already mentioned, the project was funded within the University of Warsaw Excellence Initiative, Action 1310, and it received a positive recommendation of the University of Warsaw Ethics Committee. So now Agnes will tell you a little bit about the fieldwork that she's done with Fatima. I will maybe stop sharing my presentation and leave the floor to Agnes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, hello everyone. It's nice to be here. Yes, like Joanna said, I'm a cultural anthropologist. My background is religious studies. So it was a new context for me, but perhaps not completely. And I'm going to present a relatively objective ethnographic presentation about the fieldwork that I and Fatima, she's not joining us, is she today, Fatima? No, okay. That we conducted. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yes, you can see my screen. Okay. So, oh, I have to close this. I lost my, Jana, can you see on the right side of the panel everybody's image?
No, only yours.
Only mine. So I'm the only one who sees this, but I need to close it because it's blocking my view of my own presentation. Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to start with the methodology. So most important for me as a decolonial ethnographer, I follow the discourse around decolonizing ethnography. So it was really crucial for me to deeply reflect on my own engagement with other researchers and research participants And this will most definitely apply when I relate my experience with Fatima, with working with a translator so closely. I have worked with a translator in the past, but we would meet for certain interviews, whereas I was living with Fatima basically 24/7. So adopting a decolonial perspective also means employing continual reflexivity and reflection over my own contemporary colonial habits of being. So as always, methodology consists of participant observation, but it's important to note that participant observation is not only interviews, it's everything. It's absolutely everything the moment I enter the field to the moment I decide that my fieldwork is over. So it means nuances, the mundane. My own personal experience is a very important part of ethnography. Yes, so thick participation, in-depth interviews with closed and open questions, formal and semi-formal. And this method, one of the main tools of anthropology, enables a deeper immersion into the reality of the studied groups, as well as partial sharing of their experience. It also enables contextualization of the narratives gathered during interviews. The interviews were recorded on a dictaphone after obtaining permission, of course. All participation was voluntary and for now anonymous, or I wrote down the commentary as field notes. I also kept an observation log, so like my own personal journal and diary, which is also a vital part of field work. And the first interviews were conducted using a pre-drafted interview scenario, which of course evolved in the process. It was very pliable, it was adaptable. And the initial questionnaire was changed according to different groups. I will go through the questions in a second. And it allowed to capture the anthropological learning process of the researcher, so of me, as well as to conduct subsequent interviews in new ways enabled by the process that I was in. And of course, most of our fieldwork took place inside homes of the locals, apart from a few interviews that took place in a market, having tea with a tea lady. But generally they were inside homes. We have between 30 to 40 recorded interviews. Of course, not everything was recorded. The exact amount of participants is not clear because people would come and go during interviews. They would change. The person that I started with would not be the person I would finish with. So it was really spontaneous a lot of the time, because that's just how the setting was at the moment. And yeah, the interviews included mainly adult women with some commentary from teenage girls. And of course, we took photographic and video documentation. So areas of focus. Here we have 5, and I'm going to try to really keep it concise because these lists of questions that I made were quite lengthy, and I debated on whether I should share them with you, but it's too much. And so, of course, we had a general area of focus around clothes, history, family. So about typical Sudanese style. Where does it come from? How did your mother or grandmother dress? And then I went on to the role of women. Are women responsible for maintaining traditional and cultural practices? Nubia and its history. Of course, this was really only applicable for the Mahas region for when we were in Miseda. But I thought this was a pretty significant area and that it would be worth delving into asking about Nubia, and because I know Nubia has a very rich history and there was definitely a lot of information in regards to attire or clothing that we can collect. And of course, the main focus, which is authority, social hierarchy, status. How is it expressed? By what? How is it understood? And then, of course, special occasions. This was a very big topic, weddings or funerals. and of course different tribal differences, so how people dress according to region, ethnicity, and so on. So here we start with Miseda, and we have women in the early evening. I would say they are sorting through millet or sorghum. I'm not 100% sure, but this gives you a sort of a glimpse into the attire that they have on them. They have their heads covered. I wouldn't necessarily say that they are wearing traditional togs, as we will see later on, but we can see in one of the images that a woman is wearing a jalabiya, which we would actually consider to be something like a nightgown, but it was enough to be considered a kind of traditional attire. So here we have a little bit more of a tob, and of course I'm I'm wearing it on the right side. It was very, very large. I was quite astonished at the amount of material that actually went into a tob. And it was kindly borrowed to me by a very kind woman. And on the left, we have a typical courtyard, and the women, from what I remember, fatur or breakfast has just finished. But this gives you an idea of what the tob looks like, how it's wrapped, and of course it is wrapped differently according to different regions. Okay, so I want to go into some first observations and the different common themes that I found in Miseda. So right now I just want to focus on my fieldwork in this region. So it's a small population of mostly women. And in general, Miseda is really a very tiny village. And I wish we had counted exactly how many people were in the village, but it's really, I don't know, maybe Joanna knows more precisely, but it's really very few people. The outdoor environment remained mostly empty. It was unpopulated, which is the absolute reverse of Soba, which is a populous city, a melting pot of cultures and identities. In Miseda, the local women I had seen and spent time with, so neighbors, our cook, they were often wearing very colorful garments, a tob, but usually mixed with some kind of Western elements like leggings, an Adidas shirt, or a jalabiya, like I mentioned, which we would consider something like a kind of dress, nightgown. But it's important to note that these elements of clothing in Miseda were quite worn and torn and faded from use and washing, thinning of the material, often torn in places. The women wore very often the same clothes daily. I noticed that there was no makeup, hair was often undone. However, I did notice henna, which was quite common on the hands. And I also noticed or observed in our discussions or interviews quite a contrast between the decadence the women spoke of, so the great clothing of the past, the gold, the jewelry, contrast between what they're wearing now and how their attire, daily attire, looks on a day-to-day basis. Authority from my fieldwork was strongly understood, not so much in terms of dress, but in terms of age and knowledge, which I will get to later, as older women had privileges as well as the possibility to wear a white tob, as Joanna mentioned. The white tob will definitely be a significant theme that will reoccur, and I will touch upon many times in this presentation. And it's important to note that the women associated the white tob also with not only authority, but a sort of a purity. But an example of authority amid older women was that in Miseda, older women were able to participate in Sufi ceremonies on Friday, and they would wear a white tob to participate in those. The only other place where I saw women wearing a white tub was at the local school in Niseda that we briefly visited. So it's also important to note that the women on a daily basis, in contrast to Soba, did not wear an abaya, which I will show an image of later, which was very, very common in Soba. And the women rarely covered their heads. In Niseda, if they did, it was very loosely covered. It was only when a woman from Kerma came to visit, she had on a black abaya. And of course, the teachers at the school also wore abayas. So the colors of white and red were really significant, and these were repetitive themes. White being worn by teachers or the elderly, and red as the color of the wedding ceremony, jirtig, or the hats worn by leaders of Zar ceremonies were also red. And as far as, I will also touch upon this later, but the identity or tradition of the Mahas region, or Mahas, their local identity took precedence over the traditions of Islam. And however, all the women did, of course, identify as Muslim. However, the Nubian language was the tradition they found most necessary to preserve, as well as the Mahas identity. A few of the older women also were very hesitant to speak with me. One quite clearly stated that she's afraid of, the term was white people, but maybe Westerners. And it's also important to note that in talking about clothing, religion was almost never discussed, apart actually from my conversations with Fatima. She was the only person I really discussed Islam with. And some really important common themes, and by common themes, I mean themes that kept appearing throughout interviews with different people. And there were a lot of them. So I will try to really be concise and give a summary of the most important common themes, even though I think they're all very important. In terms of clothes, so glittery or shiny clothes were considered to be bad. Only during weddings or special events. And of course, as I said, white is a color that conveys authority. It's really well understood amid women. So grannies, as they were called, or the elderly, were able to wear white. Teachers, and also a midwife had the kind of authority to wear a white tub. And so women were also the keepers of superstitions, and I mention this because often these were represented or kind of carried out through the wearing of jewelry, some sort of adorning the body in a specific way, whether wearing a specific necklace, jewelry, a specific way to cover the head. This is attire. So this also had a lot to do with gold rings for protection and as such. Women here in Niseda felt that they were the keepers of tradition. Whereas in Soba, both the women felt the men are also the keepers of tradition. But again, I will just remind that really Niseda was a community which consisted predominantly of women. And I believe the men were abroad or somewhere else for work. And in Niseda, the women were of course responsible for a lot of physical manual labor, which can also explain the way their clothes looked on a day-to-day basis. I mean, they were responsible for fixing the house, the fence, carrying wood, carrying bricks, working on the farm, reapplying mud on the house, and really, really difficult tasks that they were responsible for. In Niseda, the Mahas tradition took precedence over the Sudanese whereas in Soba, the women really identified as being Sudanese. And of course, the tradition of Maghreb tea, Taub was the preferred attire of choice versus the abaya in Soba. Divorce was really prevalent in Niseda. And some insights into just the daily tasks of the women. So the tradition of cutting and drying okra in every courtyard, I think. Well, here this is an image of me getting henna applied. This is a very arduous process, meaning it takes a long time. I think for this sort of henna to be applied, you need at least, it took 4 hours for me, just a tremendously long time. But here is another image of me cutting okra in the courtyard. So this was very, very common in Niseda. Of course, a very obvious difference between the two communities is specific oral intonation. So in Niseda, there's a kind of clicking of the tongue that was not found in Soba. They have new beauty ideals. So the new beauty ideal was to have as white of a face as possible, dark eyes and lips, which were sometimes permanently stained with henna. Of course, before the ideal was scarification, which was called shuluch. A lot of the women slept in their clothing, so it was the same clothes that you used for sleep as for everyday activities. And the discussions among the women, like background discussions, the women were preoccupied in Niseda with animal grazing, lack of grass. These were some farming. These were some common issues that the women discussed amongst themselves. And I know this because I would ask my translator to sometimes give me insights on, can you tell me what are those women in the corner? What are they speaking about? So this was definitely a topic of interest for them. The women here shared village duties, as the image before showed, separating millet. There was an importance of objects I found in Niseda, for example, the importance of the khalifa, which is like a large decorative dresser that is very visible once you enter the house. And in Niseda, I found that they were more keen on maintaining pre-Islam traditions. And also they were very aware of local Nubian traditional architecture. And this was something that was often showed to me, the inside of houses. And yeah, it was mentioned quite often. Okay, so now we move on to Soba. So the image on the left, you see Fatima, and we're interviewing a woman. And of course, we wanted to have as many interviews with women who were elders, as we believe that they would hold the most knowledge, or would be able to share with us like the broadest history of the regions. And on the right, we have in Soba a woman who is quite traditionally roasting at the moment coffee beans, and she will make very, very strong coffee out of those beans. And this was something that took place really quite often. And there is quite a difference. In Soba, the emphasis was more on drinking coffee, whereas in Niseda, it was more on drinking tea. Again, this is the inside of the home where I'm waiting. And yeah, we are waiting to start drinking tea. There will be music, some dances. They're called arusa dances. So dances that a woman does for her husband, for her newly married husband. Of course, everything was brought on a tray. This is something worth mentioning. We have an assortment of different trays. Okay, and this is, by the way, an abaya on the right-hand side. So as you can see, it's more modern. It's quite different than the tob. And I want to start with some of the common themes in Soba. So it's important to note that the women, the community that I worked with in Soba, regarded themselves as being Maghreb, Magarba, which means that they have roots coming from Morocco, if I remember correctly, and so they kind of this identity was always in the background, although they did consider themselves to be Sudanese. And in Soba, there were many more younger women, and the women in general, Soba is a very populated area. And the younger women were very keen on comfort. And they said that the abaya is much more comfortable, that the tob is always falling down. It's not easy to work, to do things, to do housework in the tob. So younger women prefer to wear the abaya. And they did wear the tob sometimes around the house or for special occasions. And the difference in Soba was that the tubs or the abayas, they were always very new, very clean, very well cared for. And this probably stems from the fact that these women in Soba were not doing the heavy lifting as the women in Niseda, where they were actually, their lives revolved around the home and not so much working outside of it. So in Soba, there was a really strong emphasis on marriage and weddings. Most of our discussions, the discussions somehow naturally navigated towards that direction. I did not come across, I did not identify attachments to decorative items, such as in the mahas, where you have the certain pieces of furniture, traditional cooking ware. I did not find such attachments to those items. Women were more fully dressed and covered than in Niseda, meaning that the scarf or the hijab or burqa was often very tight around the head, and the head was always covered. And also another difference in Soba, I was often given cola or a kind of modern beverage versus in Niseda, where that did not happen. In Soba, from our discussions, I came to the conclusion that the Soba community was less open towards alternative forms of healing, so the fakir. Divorce was also very unlikely, and I had not come across a divorced woman in Soba versus Niseda. Home duties were very significant, and Ramadan and weddings seemed to be the kind of celebrations that everybody dedicated a lot of time and effort into. And so on the left, speaking of Ramadan, in this image, we have a woman. She is creating, how to explain this? It's like a flat pancake. It's fermented sorghum.
Kisra.
No, this isn't kisra. This is abre. They're gonna make the juice for Ramadan from this one. But yeah, it's like kisra, but then there is some difference. There is some difference. And then it's made into a juice that you drink for Ramadan. And this was a very significant festival. And the women were wearing tobs, as you see, very colorful tobs for this festivity. And it's something that lasted for a few weeks. So the focus in Soba was also on the body, which was not often mentioned in Niseda, on the body being beautiful. So, of course, skin bleaching, in Niseda I came across this as well, but also about these kinds of saunas. So duhan or dukhan, I think. It's a kind of traditional technique where you kind of, you dig a hole into the earth and you burn incense in it, and you kind of squat above the hole, you cover your head, and you are permeated with a nice incense smoke, a nice smell. So natural skin softening techniques. So this emphasis on the body. A lot of discussions around the fact that there were a lot of traditions from Eastern Sudan that were implemented in Soba, like the farda, so a type of tob, but it was wrapped differently, so in a more Indian way, something that we would find in India. Also, the community was a little bit different, meaning they often met for coffee daily, but the meetings were often with extended families versus neighbors. Whereas in Mahaz, well, because in Miseda, the community was so small, everybody was welcome and invited. As I mentioned, they identified strongly as Sudanese, despite the knowledge of being Magarba. But they were quite unaware of any traditions that might stem from this from their ancestral land. A skirt or dress can be worn amid women in Soba. However, if they want to go out to a market, they have to put on an abaya. There was a very strong emphasis on maintaining the traditional Arusa dance, as I mentioned, which they were taught and they were learning very seriously before a wedding. And I was shown these dances, as I mentioned, and the women here were very conscious of men in the vicinity, which means if they knew that somebody was coming, or if they heard somebody coming, they would wrap themselves with their clothing, which was not the case in Niseda. Okay, here on the left we have traditional food. Here we have kisra, which is very delicious, and actually I miss Sudanese food very much. But this is a very simple meal. It's kisra, tomatoes. I cannot tell you what this sauce is made of. I think that the larger bowl, it's a kind of slimy okra sauce with lots of different spices. And then the smaller bowl, it's something very spicy with peppers. And on the right, we have traditional coffee pots, as you can call them. And here on the left, we have some women sitting outside of a school. We joined them, and then we met them spontaneously, and then we visited their homes afterwards. This was in the Soba community. And on the right, we have a woman making kisra, and you can see this is a traditional kitchen. That's pretty much all it consists of. Some water. So some key points and conclusions. Ideas around clothing of authority have changed, and top positions have been dispersed. This is from my observations that authority now lays also in other areas, transferred into new functions. I would say time, age, or knowledge. But it's also important, perhaps not in this presentation, but in further work around this topic. It's important to look closely what we mean by authority, to create a proper analysis. This is perhaps for an article that we will be writing. This is just an overall presentation, but a lot can be delved into deeper here. But yes, especially now in anthropology, we're very cautious when we use the words tradition and culture. So these are definitely areas that would have to be elaborated. Yeah, tradition, culture, authority, these are all words that would have to be properly defined. Clothes are more about fashion, especially in Soba. And by fashion, it doesn't mean that people are wearing Western clothes, but underneath they are most of the time. For example, having leggings that match the abaya, so coordinating colors, and comfort was really, really key. And prestige, or you can say authority, although I wouldn't use the term authority here, but rather prestige, came from things such as the material of the clothes or the place of production. A few times there was a lot of emphasis placed on having a tob made in Italy or Switzerland for those who can afford it. And those who can afford it usually have husbands working abroad, often in Dubai. Clothing was mentioned to me that it is also used as protection from men, the environment, as well as spirits. Other than that, little was mentioned about clothes having a religious function, although this can be so obvious and natural that it's actually bypassed in conversation. That's why observation is key. Because sometimes things that are so obvious to the local population are not discussed at all. And yes, tob is recognized as the traditional attire of Sudan and is worn differently in different regions. In speech, tradition has become more of a memory, especially in Soba, as modernity is continuously encroaching. And again, to give an emphasis, Soba is densely populated, and it has a sort of highway that cuts right through it, and this highway leads from, I believe, Khartoum all the way to Ethiopia. So it's really a mix of everything, really. So the tob is worn at home for ceremonies, and the abaya more likely to go out for the younger women, for shopping, school, work. Both locations placed a really strong emphasis on eating fatur or breakfast together. This was key. And all the traditions of the preparations of the morning dishes and tribal identity is vital to living in Sudan. Without an identity, as I was told, you are no one. So despite the fact that you consider yourself Sudanese, you need to know where your roots are. Of course, white was very significant. I was told white was worn in the revolution as well, and this knowledge has authority. Decorative items, jewelry, significant for ceremonies, weddings, such as gold. However, it has been replaced by fake gold now. And it's very rare to actually have real gold be used in the ceremonies. Bahur, so a sort of incense, is also vital to daily activities, to cleansing oneself, the body, but also the space. And the elderly women, the grandmas, they still bear marks of prior canons of beauty, which is scarification, which the younger women no longer do. Okay, that will be next. But still, I want to say a few more things. So I managed to gather information on the significance of the tob, its local and preferred styles, colors, the significance of those colors, its historical and present day heritage. I discovered changes in tradition and the certain possible aspects for those discerned changes. The empirical data was also allowed insight into the similarities as well as differences of the traditions being practiced in clothing, but also at home in Soba and in the Mahas region. This discovery allows us to better comprehend whether a custom or tradition is more local or whether it has dispersed into becoming a general Sudanese tradition. I also collected information on what specific traditions women are the keepers of in each region. This can include the local dishes, interior and exterior styles of the homes, in the way the homes are kept, items in or outside the homes which hold particular value within the home or communities. So as I mentioned, the emphasis in Soba was on home duties strictly. The married life was of significance. Meanwhile, in Majas, the emphasis was on, I would say, more on the entire community itself. The upkeep of the home was of great significance, as usually the day started with such chores of cleaning the alleyways, which was in Miseda an extension of the home. And in the Majas, some women wore Western clothing around the house. As I mentioned, a mix of some sort of tights, t-shirt or trousers, and then quickly throwing a floral tub on top of that. And okay, so this brings me to my final area of the presentation, which is working with Fatima, our translator, an absolutely amazing, brave, and wonderful human being. She's fantastic, and I miss her very much. On the left, we were getting henna, and she got a phoenix henna. And on the right-hand side, we are visiting a woman in Soba, which I don't know how well you can see. This woman has scarification on her cheeks. And yes. So as I mentioned, I spent every single waking moment, basically, apart from when I was bathing with Fatima, and we lived together. So it was, she really became an extension of myself, and we were very close. However, that does not mean that there were not obstacles that I had to overcome. Of course, there were some cultural differences, different ways of understanding the concept of work, language barrier, and at times unwilling to disclose all information and omitting significant translations. And this was a very interesting ethnographic and anthropological experience for myself. So this experience required a lot of reflexivity from me, especially using different decolonial methods, because of course it's vital for this study to honestly incorporate the relationship between the ethnographer and the translator, and the influence this had on the conveyment as well as the creation of the obtained information. And because of this aspect, my research heavily relied also on my own observations and notes. So I come from a culture where there's a difference in the style of working, where I was expecting information to be conveyed to me in a very precise manner, word for word translation. So this is coming from my background, and I had to reflect on that significantly. And that is very rarely how information was conveyed to me. So some of the differences were, for example, the Fatima and our participants would engage in very long and lengthy conversations, and I was waiting impatiently to receive some sort of translation, and I was often met with comments like, "Oh, I'll tell you at home when we get back." And I knew that that would be very difficult in trying to remember all the details. Also, I was very detail oriented. So for me, often in the translations, I would receive a very just the main idea of what the woman that we were interviewing said. But for me, the details were vital. And this is something that I had a difficult time extracting from our interviews. So these were some of the issues. Generally, our collaboration was great, of course, but those were just some of the differences that I had to understand and incorporate into this fieldwork, because that is my work with her is just as much part of the research as anything else. Also, I found it interesting that there were some questions she would not ask. So I would ask her to ask a question and she would refuse to ask the question. And I had to accept that there were just some things that I might not have access to, which is also very telling. So yeah, I think from my side, of course, we gathered a lot of extra words. I'm not going to go, if anybody's interested in these words, they can contact us. Different words noted in Niseda, a lot of these are Nubian. What, of course, I didn't mention that in Niseda, the women also spoke Nubian, and this was why we were also working with Fatima, was because she spoke Arabic and Nubian and English, of course, and that was very important for us. And this fieldwork, it really opens the door for a lot of really interesting research articles, interpretations, whether historical, contemporary, or the direction that this research has taken and where it's going in the future. So I believe that's it from me. So thank you. If anyone has any questions, please let me know. I have to stop sharing my screen.
Joanna, would you like to join?
Yes,
Sorry, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm here. Yeah, so summarizing our research on this topic from my perspective, our conclusions follow in two different directions. First, okay, sorry, I was distracted by the comments. So first, when it comes strictly to the issue of women communicating status via their clothing. So as Agnes mentioned, authority is strongly understood in terms of age. So women, older women have certain privileges, including the possibility of wearing certain clothes, such as white top, which bears a strong significance. Colors in general carry important meaning for the Sudanese, and white is considered sunnah, so a color preferred by the Prophet. It is actually interesting how white is actually the color the men wear in Sudan, and it's only by the way of distinction that women are allowed to wear white. It is not an everyday practice. Thob is considered traditional Sudanese clothing by the Sudanese. Despite its recent history, it can be worn casually at home, but even when abaya is worn outside, so for school, for work, thob is worn for ceremonial occasions such as weddings, funerals, and so on. And here we come to the wider significance of our investigation. So obviously, in terms of continuity and relation to the historic narrative, we realized that the thob and many other pieces of clothing that were mentioned here and women wear today have no direct linkage to the garments that were worn in the past. As I mentioned, top has its roots in the 19th century. However, what clearly came to the foreground during our continuity of practice and people's mindsets. So, as Agnes also mentioned, women are the keepers of tradition in the Sudanese society. They nurture the traditional practices. They are more conservative than men, and they insist on sustaining old customs. Tribal identity is very strong in Sudan. Interestingly, however, in the suburbs of Khartoum, where people belong to the tribes, or mostly belong to the tribes, that trace their roots to the Arab ethnic groups who immigrated to Sudan in waves over many centuries since the Arab conquests, women are more conservative and they are more driven by their attachment to Islam, while in the north, the region known as historical Nubia, affinity to local tribes, which are believed to be indigenous, takes precedence over other components of identity, even being Muslim, even though it is the faith people declare being affiliated with. So women there often declare that their customs have pre-Islamic roots, and they consider themselves the keepers of those traditions, and they care very much to keep them alive. And here we arrive at this nexus between historical archaeology and cultural anthropology. As we found during our research, and we'll probably will in the future as well, we have very different ways of looking at things, of analyzing certain practices. Even when Agnes spoke about the way traditions, culture are being defined in anthropology, is very different from the way we speak about those terms in archaeology, in historical narrative. So it's very interesting for us to meet at this nexus between those various ways of approaching things. The results of this project, although admittedly very small in scope, give indication that there is certain continuity in cultural practice that is worth investigating in the future. And I certainly hope that it won't be long until we will be able to go back to Sudan and undertake more research projects with local communities. And there are two things that I wanted to say at the end. So first of all, I wanted to thank my amazing team. So Agnes, first of all, and Fatima, who unfortunately isn't with us today. And there's one thing I wanted to share with you for anyone who's interested. Maybe I will here. Yeah, does it work? Yeah, can you see the screen? So this is an article that was published in 2021 in the Journal of Public and International Affairs concerning the way the clothing, especially the white tie-up, which is plural for top, plays into the political landscape in Sudan, and the way gender actually engages with those discussions. I would really recommend this article. It's very interesting. And actually some observers, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they've noticed how political affairs are also reflected in outfits, in garments. And even back then, some of the top were named after contemporary political events. So it's a very interesting read. If anyone's interested, I can send them the link. Okay, so that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Your cooperation is a quite good example of what we try to do here at the Archaeoriental Research Group. Is combining archaeology with, well, not to use the Oriental studies, but people that deal with African and Asian cultures. And now I open the discussion, and I think Dobrova is the first one to ask the question. No, you're not. So Magda is.
Hi, yeah, we are all together. Good evening to everyone, and thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Yeah, my question is, did you have any information on who is choosing actually the garments? Do the women bear, I mean, they are able to purchase themselves their garments? Or is maybe you mentioned husband working abroad and bringing tops? So I think this is in like an important information to know, you know, at which level they have actually an impact of what they wear. And also if they purchase these clothes themselves, where? So also the question of availability, do they have choice in colors, patterns, and things like that?
I could answer this question. Yes, it's true that some you thank you for the question, and you sort of answered your own question. Yes, at times men who are working abroad, they do bring back, let's say, high quality material tobs. The women can buy them themselves from the markets in the souk. There are choices. For example, in Miseda, they would have to travel to, I would assume, Kerma, which is probably like the closest large city. Although the truth is, I'm not exactly sure how it works with the handling of money. I know that in certain situations, a woman cannot hand money to a man. I have been in such a situation myself in Sudan. So I'm not completely sure if they're accompanied by somebody, by a family member, an uncle, brother. So that would be my response.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Come on, me, please.
Sorry. Hi, thank you for the interesting research presentation. I have a question. I did also some interviews in Nubia in Sikut. It's north of Mahas. And then it was interesting to see the difference even between women in the same community, that the age was quite different to see how they think about heritage or how they want to keep the heritage. So I was wondering if you found any kind of like age, the differences between ages among women.
You mean differences in their kind of relationship to clothes?
Well, in a way about more like a generally heritage, because like for most clear example I had was, I had a local woman who graduated from the University of Khartoum and as a translator for both Arabic and Nubian. And then she's an educated woman and she had a lot of pride in this. And then when we are interviewing old woman, she always did not forget to say that this is an old thinking. So when a woman is talking about some kind of rituals or how they should perform life, like doing things, everyday life things, she kept saying, after she translates, she kept saying that this is old thinking, just to make sure that this is not the way she thinks or younger generation thinks. So that was, for me, it was really interesting. And then Joanna mentioned about continuity. So like how this gonna go when she became a mother, and actually she's a mother now, and how it continues to the next generation. So I wonder if this is something local or personal things for her, or more generally we can see this kind of difference between the ages.
Well, I didn't mention that Fatima, she is from the Mahas region. So that's perhaps really important information that, my apologies, I omitted. And Fatima is well educated. She's also an archaeologist, and she's in her early 30s, and she does not have children. She does wear pants sometimes, which is very rare and is not very common. She didn't make references like this is an old way of thinking. She was extremely respectful of anything said by an elder. The women in Soba did not, from our conversations and from what I can recall, did not have aspirations to leave Soba. The few younger women that I spoke to in Mahas, and there were really very few younger girls. There was one who was 18, and she was already also really getting into the role of I mean, education was not on the forefront, if that's what you're asking for her. And she was very happy participating in the different home duties. The women in Soba, now I remember, they were very curious about me, about my lifestyle, about my ideas about love and relationships, less so than in Niseda. So there was a sort of curiosity. Of course, in Soba also, there were more schools, so more women were teachers. So of course, more young girls were educated from different. Well, maybe this is a little bit off topic, but in general, I also spent a lot of time in Sudan on a previous occasion. And some girls they really wanted to go abroad. They really wanted to go to Dubai and to live and study and work there. And that was kind of really a sign of prestige that they could go and have that opportunity. I hope that answers your question. I mean, of course, there was a big difference between the elderly women and the younger women. Just the fact that the younger women were also on their phones, often they already had cell phones and things like that. And that's something that, when I would ask about change, what has changed, nobody would mention technology, like the encroachment of technology. That whole part was omitted when I spoke about what has changed, which can also be kind of deconstructed and yeah.
Maybe I can add a few words. So this is somewhat anecdotal, and it was not a part of our research. But since I've been working in Sudan, you probably know I've been working with Mariusz in Soba for the last few years. And every year we have at least a few students, 2/3 of them being female. Also, I had an opportunity to be with a brief visit to a female dormitory in Khartoum, speaking with dozens of girls. And it's actually a very interesting observation, I might add. So first of all, when girls are in a group, they are more engaged in those, as Agnes said, they are mostly on their phones or flirting with boys and so on. But when you speak to them one-on-one, or if only girls are present, they are very keen on speaking about the things that distinguish us. So they ask me about Poland, the traditions, what our life is like. But it turns out that many of them, they know a lot about the traditions, about the customs, about their previous culture, especially the ones practiced by their mothers, their grandmothers. And they were so keen on sharing with me and actually like digging in their memory for the things that their mothers or grandmothers used to do. So, I got the feeling that they take a lot of pride with having this strictly Sudanese or in some cases Nubian culture that kind of distinguishes them from us, makes like it feels, the way they are speaking about it feels like they feel special by sharing this culture with us. So I think this is this role of being the keepers of traditions. It's not only being passed on from mothers to daughters, but also it's being nurtured. And I think they are being taught to feel proud of it. So I think it's more visible in small villages and small settings where, especially the like rural Miseida, it's a very small village, and it's visible at first sight. But even in those urban settings, they are still being taught how to preserve those traditions, if that answers the question.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, so if not, I will allow myself to ask some. So first of all, Agnes, you said that tops are being worn differently in different societies. So if you could give some examples, especially can you, and this question comes from my field of research, which is Ethiopia. Can you wear a top in a way that it will show your attitude or the state of your life that you are in or the mood you are in?
Those are good questions. I did ask questions. How do your clothes make you feel? How do you feel in them? In which pieces do you feel best? Do any feel restrictive? And those answers were somehow, sometimes the way we understand these ideas are received a little bit differently. So I think some of these questions that are really subjective were a little bit lost in translation. The way tobs are worn differently, it's very hard to explain. They are literally just wrapped differently. So it would be very hard. You would have to see.
But what do you mean differently? I mean, again, if I may, when it comes to Ethiopia, the traditional garments are shammas worn by men, and the way they wrap shammas, which is also a big sheet of paper, of white cotton, the way they wrap it around themselves gives their interlocutor the meaning. Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they too proud to be there? So do women wrap tops because this is the way they do it, because it's in a way fashion does it, or is it because they want to show something?
I did not come across any information or nothing of such appeared in a conversation that somebody would wrap a tob a specific way to convey their mood or how they are feeling. I think that part was left to color, not the exact wrapping.
If I may, just there is a book about Sudanese traditional clothing by Griselda Al-Taib, and she writes in this book that at least in the 70s and 80s, maybe it's not practiced anymore. This is why Agnes did not encounter it. So the general idea of the top is to kind of cover your figure. So it's like, so your shape as a woman, it's not as visible. But then there is a way to wrap your top around your hips so they are more sexy, and even and it allows women to kind of walk differently, to swing their hips, and to appear more enticing to the men. I'm not sure if they do it anymore.
Yeah, I didn't see anything like that. No. There was often a mention of a leather skirt. That I have the name in our little dictionary that we made, but this was very different than from wrapping a tob around. I think you asked something else that I might have omitted. There was another question.
No, let me go through my notes because I noted some things.
Okay.
Yeah, if you could give examples of different wrappings.
I don't know, Joanna. How to explain?
To be precise, did it differ between Soba and Miseida?
I don't think it does that much. So sometimes you can see that some women pay more attention to it being wrapped more tightly.
Yeah.
But I think it's a matter of being more conservative, maybe. There used to be different ways of wrapping the top, especially for different purposes. So if you want to carry a baby inside, or like cover yourself when you are breastfeeding, or actually during I think it was 50s and 60s, women used to cover their faces more with the end, like the tail of the top. And they do it sometimes now. It's not very widespread. but I'm not sure there is a pattern to the wrapping, really.
Okay.
I know that
Covering your mouth would serve what purposes?
Yeah, well, different purposes for different women, probably. Some women cover their faces, especially the ones from the nomadic tribes, to cover their face from the sand, which is very common. Some of them cover their faces in the company of men, but it's not very common, really.
the
So
only
just
thing
for the sake of savoir vivre, I guess. Because again, in Ethiopia, which I'm aware is not Sudan, you cover your face because you're afraid of Buddha, which is evil, or you want to tell a secret. Men and women do it.
I didn't come across anything like that. You asked about mood, how somebody feels. So if somebody is feeling like in a celebratory, festive mood, they will wear like a glittery tob, but that's usually reserved for special occasions and ceremonies. Then you're feeling very festive. But generally, it's looked down upon just to wear a very glittery, shiny tob, just for everyday purposes. When I was going to these Abre festivals, which I say festivals, which means different houses that were making abre. The women were dressed up really in a festive way. You can see they were wearing their fanciest, shiniest, newest tob. So for the making of abre, so that was expressing mood, that they were feeling festive and preparing for Ramadan. Yeah.
Okay, so more color than color and glittery than the way of wrap, right?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
And one more question. What about you said the ethnicity or tribalism, which I know that both words can now be controversial, but because you made your research in Miseida, which is, if I'm not wrong, in the north, whereas Toba is south of Khartoum. And do you think that would it be interesting for your research to think that the people living in Miseida, they feel more Nubian than the Southerns. Therefore, the women would wear tops instead of abayas, because the ones that are, I mean, Yana, we already discussed that the people living southern or near Khartoum are not real Sudanese, whatever that would mean.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So the people living in Mahas, where Miseida is located, they belong to the historical Nubia, and they identify themselves as Nubian, while the people around Khartoum, they are not Nubian at all. Nubia never reached, it may be called in some historical research, it may be called Nubia, but it was never Nubia. Actually, in the suburbs of Khartoum, as Agnes said, it's a melting pot. There are so many different groups of people, and even the ones who declare being Sudanese, they trace their roots to the tribes like the Mugarba tribe, who arrived in Sudan over the centuries after the 7th century CE. So they might have mixed in with the Sudanese from the valley, but apparently they carry on with different traditions. So they probably there's some influence from the Sudanese as well, like from the original indigenous Sudanese, let's say, and I'm sure there are differences. But in terms of clothing, as you said, it's probably more popular for women in the south to wear the abaya, as it's considered more Muslim. But then there is also this interesting tribal distinction In the south, in the east, near the Red Sea, actually the Eastern Desert, there are tribes who belong to the Beja groups. If I could share my presentation for a moment, I showed you at the beginning, just for a second. I showed you at the beginning this beautiful lady wrapped in orange shawl. So this photo was actually taken in Kassala. It's near the Eritrean border. And she belongs to the Beni Amer tribe, and they are a part of the Beja congregation of tribes. They are known to have those Indian influences. So in Arabic times already, when the trade flourished with India, they brought those fabrics which resemble Indian sari. They are much lighter, they are more vivid in color, they are quite different. And as you can see, she wears a lot more jewelry. This is not a tradition from the Nile Valley. So there are definitely some tribal differences, and some of them have already been described in various publications. But we have not, as you know, we have not researched this part of Sudan, so it's really hard to tell.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Okay, if not, I think we can finish our seminar. Thank you for being here. Hoping to see your publication soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, and see you soonish.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thanks for joining.